Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we are back. Woo woo! I am so excited about this. We are with Dr. Robert Melillo today again because we have only talked about left brain overactivity last time with learning disabilities, and I was super fascinated. I can totally geek out on the scientific stuff about that. Absolutely phenomenal. And just the idea that we can overcome those issues. And now we're talking about right brain overactivity and really talking about more of behavioral stuff, right? So, like, ADHD, ADD, autism, ODD, things like that. And so, we really want today to talk about what are some of those issues. We're going to give a little recap of kind of the general idea of the imbalances, how it happens, and things like that. But I honestly couldn't be more excited to have Dr. Melillo back with us today because he is so super knowledgeable and he's so passionate about really making sure that we're getting for not only for kids but for all adults. And we were really having this conversation afterwards about society and the imbalance in society of just showing that brain wise. It was absolutely fascinating. We should have got that on the live too. But anyways, Dr. Melillo, can you please just share with us again a little bit about your background and this brain imbalance and just kind of give us a general overview?
Yeah. So again, just to set the tone, last time we talked about more dyslexia, learning disabilities, dyscalculia, memory issues, and the overactive right brain, which could create certain emotional issues, anxiety, social anxiety, right? This time we're going to talk about more right brain delays with left brain overactivity, where that is more what we see in things like classic ADHD, autism spectrum, OCD, Tourette's, tics, schizophrenia, psychosis, things like that. So, all of this to me, all of these labels, when you hear them, this started for me as a parent when my son was labeled with ADHD. I knew a lot about the brain. I knew a lot about neurology. I was a clinician already for over 10 years. I was teaching, on a graduate level, clinical neurology, but I didn't really know what ADHD was. I didn't know what autism was. I didn't know what those things were in the brain because I didn't work with a lot of it at that time. And this was in the early 90s when all of this stuff was just starting to really kind of, reach a certain level of awareness or diagnostic level. And my first question was, well, what is it? I mean, as someone who knows neuroscience and knows neurology and rehab, my first thought was, okay, well, what's actually happening in the brain? And no one could really answer that question for me. So that's when I decided, okay, I need to answer this myself. As a parent and as a clinician, I was recognizing that we were starting to see the beginning of this epidemic that was starting. And I could see where it was going. And so I thought that, this was really where I needed to go with this. So that's really what started with me into this, that question, and really has driven me for over 30 years now. And I think I've come up with, as good of an answer as anybody has out there, but it wasn't just out of curiosity. It was about what can we do about it? How can we change it? My focus has always been rehab and neurological rehab. So it's about how do we rehabilitate this? How do we change it? But you need to know what it is first. And that's the thing. Most people have no clue to that. They hear these labels, they're thrown out there, but they don't think, okay, well, what does that mean in the brain? How does this come about? And then that's also where the answer lies as to how we can change it. People hear things like, well, this is a lifelong problem that you're just going to have to live with and it's genetic. And most of those answers are not really 100% true and accurate. And that's a big thing.
Absolutely. And I just totally got it wrong too again. Oh my gosh. So the right brain delay is what causes the behavioral issues. Okay. I'm getting it. I love it. It's fascinating to me. So, in thinking about like how do we get an imbalance like that? What is the causation for that? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of things, but what is some of the factors?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we know, even in psychology, I mean, I have a master's in clinical rehabilitation neuropsychology, as well as a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience. So in that world, more and more we're realizing that almost all adult mental health issues start in childhood. And that really all of it starts in childhood, that really these are developmental imbalances where it is actually superimposed. And what starts it off is really people that are very gifted, that have areas of their brain that are really, more, that start out stronger than most people. And those are things that built on family traits. So we see that some of these similar traits may run in families, but they're not based on genetic mutation. So something like autism or ADHD or dyslexia, there's no single gene mutation that explains it, like Down syndrome or Fragile X. It's not like that at all. There's no damage or anything wrong with the genes. Maybe their expression may be off, but it does run in families because it's built on personality traits. And most of these traits that lead to disabilities at another level actually give the individual great advantage. That's why we see them increasing, where you would think if it was a disability, that if it was a gene that gave them a disability or a disadvantage, that it would be going away over time, right? Because genes that don't benefit you usually eventually go away. But we see that these genes or these types of disorders are exploding, especially these type that we're talking about today, the right brain deficit, left brain overactivity. We see that autism went from, 1 in 10,000 in the 60s and 70s to now it's, 1 in 36 or 1 in like 22 boys. And that's probably underdiagnosed. And because we're moving more and more to this left brain society, over the past, couple of hundred years, we've moved more and more with the development of technology and literature and science, and all of that has moved. Our education has moved really towards this left brain type of world, which is more detail oriented and factually oriented and goal directed, and looking at words and speaking and talk therapy and all of those things, sitting more, not interacting, being more in a virtual world than the real world, kind of being more and more separate as individuals, and with the growth of technology. And so we're seeing a rise of these right brain deficiency, left brain deficits. And again, these are superimposed on, it starts out with a gift, people that are born with very strong left brain skills. And then our early development doesn't build that right brain like it used to. And so what can happen is the left brain comes online too early, and then it holds back that right brain. And this is what creates this developmental imbalance. And one of the keys that we look at is what we call retained primitive reflexes as a main factor that holds back that brain and also creates this imbalance.
That's fascinating. We could talk forever about the history behind that and where civilizations and how it develops, and versus us, as you were saying, about the, more left brain society, and that we're getting more, goal oriented, and then we have more time to focus on those things because of different aspects in our development of humanity and societies. I love that.
With that, these are two books. The reference to a lot of that, along with me, is a guy named Ian McGilchrist.
I've heard of him.
He's a psychiatrist out of the UK, and he's written, 3 massive books at this point. One called The Master and His Emissary, but then these 2 books, which are 2 volumes called The Matter with Things. And he really is more about the philosophy of looking at moving towards a left brain world with the development of Western civilization and how that is related to the increase in psychiatric conditions. So he has done a really good job of that. So anybody that's really interested in reading up on that, now, again, he doesn't have a lot of the ways to change it like I do, but he's a very eloquent writer as well.
That's amazing. I would be super fascinated to read that. Yeah. So, and thinking about, okay, we know this imbalance is there. And I love also the idea that, we have this gifted child because they are, they have this one area that they're really good at. And we find that a lot with kids, who we have our kid who's very, ADD, but they're very artistic, very, they're very musical or something like that. And so that is something where we're starting, I feel like, as a society, to stop seeing kids as it is a dysfunction. As a parent, it can be hard for us to feel like they're, disadvantaged, and then, to see that giftedness and to really play into that. I love that. But obviously we need to give them some skills so that they can balance that out, so that we're not having problems as adults later. So in terms of thinking about that, what do you see as far as the right brain deficiency? What are some of the, like, telltale signs? How do we know we have that going on?
Well, the right brain develops in the first 3 years, right? So the right brain is taking the lead in development. So many of the more extreme issues, they really show up in the beginning in the first 3 years. That's why autism typically should be diagnosed by 3 years, even though it's diagnosed later, only because people kick the can down there. But so looking at early development, but by 1 year of age, pretty much every child should be able to walk, a few steps, talk a few words, and be able to point and have really good eye contact. If a child by 1 is not doing any of those things, meaning maybe they're walking but they're not talking, or maybe they're talking but they're not pointing at all, there's an issue. And especially kids with right brain delays, the main problem is really pointing, and the fact that they may also really not have eye contact and really good nonverbal communication. They're not developing a sense of their body. So they may have an unusually high pain threshold. They may not have a normal appetite. They may either undereat or overeat from the time they're young. They usually have an overactive immune response. So they may start with things like eczema early on, or they may, when they have formula or dairy-based products, they may develop reflux early on, and really be fussy. Some of these kids might be, really very easy. Some kids are harder, but if a child is like unusually easy, like we had a kid who clearly they had eczema and they had a lot of gas and they had reflux, but they never cried. So they never seemed to be colicky. It's because even though they were having all these really severe issues, they didn't feel pain. So it didn't bother them. And so these are kids that, again, they may be delayed or altered in their motor skill development. They may be delayed in speech, but their main thing is that really they're not going to point. They don't have good eye contact, or they're not really, they're not approaching other children at a very young age. They're not really interested in that. And they may start with tics or stimming behavior or repetitive behavior or OCD, turning on and off the lights repetitively, opening, closing closet doors repeatedly, doors. They may line up their toys. They may, run back and forth, jump up and down, flap their hands, walk on their toes, really like routines and not be like, don't want to get out of their routines. They're very fixated on certain things. These are things that we see more with right brain delays, where the left brain has come online too early. But with kids that are a little bit higher functioning, what we see is that when that left brain comes online too early, they may have really early interest in letters and numbers and looking at books. They may read early. We get some kids that can read, teach themselves to read before the age of 2. They may, be obsessed with numbers and letters and looking at books. And even kids that are non-speaking, if they're looking at books a lot, like they're really looking through them, they're probably reading. I had one kid that the mother realized the child was reading at 8 months of age. 8 months. No one should read before the age of 4, really. And that's why the whole idea of doing like flashcards before the age of like 4 is wrong, completely wrong. The last thing we want to do, is get the left brain online too early. And right now, screens like using phones or screens or iPads for young kids. I mean, I don't think any kid should look at a screen before the age of 3, at the earliest, preferably before the age of 6, because left brain stimulate that left brain. And if your child has any risk of autism or ADHD or anything, if you stimulate that left brain too much, you can make it significantly worse. And then, also getting them to do flashcards and trying to read or memorize things early. They should be feeling their body and spatially and moving around in a natural environment. They should be interacting with other people and other kids through touch and smells and taste and all of those things. So, this is what we typically see with more of a right brain delay, and that's how it starts.
That is so fascinating. Oh my gosh, there's so many characteristics there that you described that I'm like, oh, that's my son. Oh yeah, he did that. He used to line up his toys all in a perfect line. He was a really early reader, not that early. He read by 4, but it was so it's definitely, yeah, he's got it's body awareness has taken a long time. He's 16 and it's just coming online, like that body awareness. But he does martial arts, so it's been kind of helping him really pull that together. But it's so fascinating. Wow, that's super fascinating. I love that. So in terms of thinking about, we know now that we have these issues. And what I love that you were talking about is that the pushing, and I always talk about that, is our what I call the educational should, that we feel like our kids should be reading, our kids should be, and they're reading in kindergarten and pre-K, and they're reading in preschool sometimes, and that can be really before they're ready to read and can cause a lot of issues there. But I love the brain interaction there. I hadn't really thought about it in that way. So because they end up having to go back and renegotiate reading later. If they're
also, they may read early, but they're going to struggle with reading comprehension.
Yes.
So reading comprehension is a right brain skill. The left brain skill is, also in math, is basic math operations. I just had a child, and again, we look at objective models of this, right? So I just had a child right before here, a child that is almost 6 years old from Mexico. And this child is brilliant, but he's very delayed in his speech, and he's on the autism spectrum, and he has a lot of OCD and tics and stimming and hyperactivity. But we did an academic test with this child called the Wyatt. It's the gold standard academic achievement test. Mm-hmm. And so he's 5 years old, 10 months. He was reading at an 11-year-old level. His word reading was at an 11-year-old level, but his reading comprehension was at a 6-year-old level. So his reading comprehension was at or above his age, but his word reading was almost 5 years above in a child that's only 5, right? That gap is huge. And even though this kid, even in his math scores, same thing. His right brain math was at a 7-year-old, but his left brain math was at a 10-year-old level. So what we see is that he had, everything was above average. He's an extremely bright kid, but this gap is huge for him, and the gap represents the problem. And so we saw that his left brain skills were at around a 10, 11-year-old level. His right brain skills were at around a 6-year-old level. And so you're talking about a 4 or 5 year gap. And with that, he has trouble speaking. He doesn't pick up on social cues. He's not interested in other children. He's got a lot of ticking and stimming going on, but he's a genius. I mean, he's literally a legit genius, and you're not even seeing it. And this is a kid whose primary language is Spanish. And these tests were given to him in English.
Wow.
right? But he also knows multiple languages already from just watching YouTube. So this is the type of example that I'm giving that we see objectively. And the good news is that when we work with them, the idea is to create this balance. Now, what we see is that 10, 11-year-old number doesn't come down, but the
Okay.
6-year-old number comes up to match it. So we
Interesting.
don't take away their natural genius. We just actually we allow them to become really what they're supposed to be, which is really fully the best version of them. And he's not the best version of himself right now, and so we're going to be able to change that in an objective way. He's already changed just in a few days of being with us.
That's so fabulous. That's so frustrating for him too, I'm sure, as it think, that he feels that as well. And so two questions I have about that. One is I'm super curious about what's left brain math and what's right brain math.
Yeah, so
I'm thinking like geometry or like spatial awareness maybe versus
yeah, you're
numbers
right.
and
So
okay.
basic math operations, so basic like number facts and counting and basic, arithmetic, division, multiplication, that's left brain.
Okay.
Right brain is more like problem solving, reasoning, like word problems, but also algebra is like left brain, geometry is right brain, that type of thing. So yeah, so that's the whole thing. It's that, and a kid may start out, and we hear this all the time. The parents are like, yeah, they were reading, they were the best reader in their class. They were like a genius. And then they got to like fourth grade and they were failing reading because they couldn't comprehend what they were reading, or they had no interest in reading because they didn't get any out of it. And so that's why it's really about this balance.
Yes.
And if there's one skill that really is really, really early on that, if your child looks like they're a genius, you have to be careful because they probably are, but they're more susceptible to an imbalance. And if you don't recognize that early, it may be a problem.
I love that. That's fascinating. And my follow-up question to that is I'm thinking as you're talking about as they get older, is there like do people normally kind of creep up and balance a little bit or does it stay imbalanced unless we do something to change that?
Again, we're all a little bit imbalanced and we all favor one side of our brain over the other, right? We're all a little bit more left brain in the way we see the world, what we call cognitive style, the way we think, or we're all a little bit more right brain, just like we're all either right-handed or left-handed to a different degree, right? I can hardly do anything with my left hand, but you get other people that are pretty good with their left, but they're definitely better with their right. And that's the way it is with our brains. And it's a little bit different with men and women as well. Women tend to favor the left brain a little bit more than the right, and men the other way around. But what we see is that if you don't have an imbalance, like where there's too much of that, I think most people over time, we all have strengths and weaknesses. And if you work at it, you can make your weakness better. And sometimes some people, even their weaknesses become their strengths. But if you have an imbalance, you are almost always going to favor your strength and you're going to really avoid the weaknesses. And that's the way, again, our education model is set up, where it's like, okay, well, they're really good at this, so let's get them to do that so they don't feel bad about what they can't do. But what you're doing is you're basically making sure that this imbalance will never be corrected. And so that's the difference. What we're dealing with are people that are struggling in some area. We're not dealing with the typical person out there that's relatively functioning in a normal level and is okay. And we all have a little problems and we all have some things we're good at, some things we're not so good at, but we're in a normal range. But more and more we see people that are literally struggling. They cannot overcome it. And most people, their strengths will outweigh their weakness, but they can't. These people, their weakness is winning out and they don't even get a chance to develop this strength. And in that case, that's never going to self-correct. It's only going to probably get worse over time. And, the earlier we can intervene, the better. But we only need to intervene if it really is impacting their lifestyle. I mean, there are people out there that identify in the autism spectrum that are brilliant and are great and may have no issues. They may not have anxiety or immune issues, or they feel like, their life is fine and they don't, and that's great. Nobody needs to intervene with that, whatever. But there are those who can't speak, and there are those who have such terrible tics or OCD that they can't function, and they need help, right? So we can't just leave them alone, in my view. No. Even though there's a certain group of people that say, well, just leave them alone. We're fine. We don't need your help. Okay. I mean, that's fine if that's what you want. But, if somebody can't speak, nobody's born supposedly not speaking, right? That's right. And nobody else has the right to tell someone that can't speak, or the parent of someone that can't speak, that you don't have the right to try to help them to try to speak or communicate, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And if it's going to impact their long-term ability to function and their ability to be successful, then that's of course what we want for our kids. Yeah. And so in thinking about that, what can we do to help help bring up that right side?
Yeah. As we talked about last time, my approach that I think is different and unique is that we tend to think of, first of all, I think more people, fortunately, are thinking about their brain and brain health. In fact, it's the number one term on Google search now in the world is brain health. Wow. So, but again, most people also operating around a lot of misconceptions, because we've all grown up primarily with a medical model or a traditional psychology model, right? And so we think about, well, we change the brain biochemically through taking drugs, or then maybe taking supplements, or then maybe with our diet. And all of those things clearly may have an impact on the brain and maybe temporarily may affect our behavior, but none of those things really significantly change the brain from a standpoint of structurally and functionally. So it's like saying that if I take vitamins, if I eat better, my body may be healthier, but it's not going to make you suddenly much stronger. It's not going to make you faster. It's not going to make you better at a sport or better at playing piano, right? You have to do those things to get better at it. Diet and nutrition and exercise and vitamins, may help or may make that happen quicker, but they don't change that ability to do something. And the brain, above all, does stuff. It does stuff all day, every day. It does everything. Everything is controlled by our brain. Our immune system is controlled by our brain. Our digestive system, our detoxification system, obviously all of our motor skills, all of our cognitive skills of any kind, the way we take in sensory information, experience our world, and process that information, the way we put this all together into thoughts and ideas and memories, and then extract that information, is all based on our brain, the way it functions and the way it connects. So we have to use the brain in a way to be able to change it significantly from a standpoint of really growing it and making it function better. So again, the right brain is about big picture skills. It's about, comprehending things. It's about wisdom. It's about understanding things. It's about perceiving the world around us and most of our senses and integrating those senses together. It first starts with really connecting to our body, feeling self-awareness, what we call interoception, where we connect with things like pain, hunger, thirst, hot and cold, going to the bathroom, being tired. For all of us, the right brain develops in the first 3 years primarily, initially, and it's subconscious. We don't remember what we learn. We don't really start forming conscious memories till after the age of 3. Before that, we have what we call childhood amnesia. And because of that, we don't really understand, but there's a lot of people, especially on the autism spectrum, especially on the non-speaking end, they really don't feel their body almost at all. They don't feel pain. At varying degrees. They may not feel temperature changes. They can tolerate hot and cold. I had one kid with autism that literally broke his arm in half, and he never cried. Never cried. No pain. They couldn't believe it in the ambulance. We have kids that they can't feel when they have to go to the bathroom. They don't feel tired, so they're up all night. They may not feel hunger and thirst at a normal level, but they don't know this because none of us remember learning that. I had one kid from Puerto Rico, he was 14, and his mother said that he drank so much water that she thought he was thirsty all the time, but then she realized that it was just an OCD behavior, and he wasn't really drinking because he was thirsty, because he drank too much water. And she said to him, "You drink too much water, only drink when you're thirsty." And he looked at her and he said, "How do I know when I'm thirsty?"
Wow.
That's an example of he didn't have interoception.
Yeah.
But how do you know it, right? Like, we're like, what do you mean he didn't know he was thirsty? What do you mean you don't know you're hungry? What do you mean you don't know pain, or you don't know what it's like to feel sad? But this is, all of these things develop in the right brain, and the right brain is driven primarily by interpersonal and social interaction first and foremost. And so we use these feelings in our body to then understand our emotions, especially right brain emotions like sadness, shame, embarrassment, guilt, fear, but empathy, connection, attachment, love, rejection, sensitivity. All of these emotions are more right brain emotions, and we use the senses to feel those emotions, and then we use those emotions to read them on other people. And that's how we connect with them. And this should happen right from the beginning. A little child should approach other children. They should be like little puppies running around, playing with one another, rolling around, learning the basic social rules of engagement. And they should already master it really by the time they're 3, right? And if you get a child that doesn't approach other children from the time they're really little and doesn't have much interest, or may approach but doesn't do it in any of the appropriate ways, there's a right brain delay happening, and they're usually probably really pretty gifted in their left brain skills. So that's kind of a basic synopsis of it.
That's so interesting. Yeah, that's so my son when he was little. He used to play just around me, and then when we were at play groups, and then he got a little braver and he would play next to kids instead of playing with them. And that's so fascinating. And I know we're running out of time, but I have to, since you mentioned it and the nutrition thing, and I know that's part of your background, so I have to ask you what part, because that is something that's talked about a lot, especially in the naturopath world, is the brain and the toxicity and nutrition aspect of that. So I know you said, it plays some role, but at what point do you see that making a significant difference in either the causation or the healing of the balance?
Yeah, it's everything. The brain is the role. And I know functional medicine, I've taught it for many years. I teach functional neuroimmunology, and that's really where our area of research is really going now. And so the traditional approach in, the biomedical world and in the neuroimmune world has always started with, there's a problem with the gut. And then that leads to things like food sensitivities and inflammation.
Right.
And then the body becomes inflamed, and you activate the inflammatory side of the immune system, and that goes up to the brain and creates inflammation, and that's the problem. And that model is wrong, basically. So it goes the other way around. It starts in the brain and the brainstem, and it starts with the balance of the maturity of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So ultimately, the brain controls it all, but it controls the digestive and the immune system through the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. When we're born with our sympathetic fight or flight system fully on.
Right.
We do have an old parasympathetic system that comes on first, but then we become sympathetically dominant by the time we're born. And so we're in this fight or flight when we're born, and that's the way it's supposed to be. And we have really fast pulse rate and really rapid breathing. We're not really digesting any food at that point. So, we have an open, leaky gut to start out with. And that is because we also are not really generating our own adaptive immune system at that point. and babies are not producing their own antibodies. They get the antibodies from the mother's breast milk. And so because of that, those antibodies are large proteins, and they wouldn't get through a normal, mature, closed up stomach lining. So our stomach lining starts out open, which most people don't know. They look at it, they say, well, you have a leaky gut, and that leaky gut came about because of inflammation or because you ate gluten, or no, it started out as a leaky gut and it never closed up. And so what should happen is over the first year, as the brainstem, the medulla, matures, we have the old parasympathetic, which is online, and then the sympathetic comes on, and then over the course of the first year, the new parasympathetic comes on, and it inhibits this, and it activates the one that controls digestion. And so when that happens, as we're about to eat solid food, and as solid food comes in, we now need to close up the gut. We now need to produce acid and enzymes to break it down. We need to increase blood flow to absorb those nutrients. And we now to increase peristalsis to move it along. What happens in most kids, and this is really well documented with our research, but other people, is that kids on both right and left deficits, but especially on the right deficit, especially in the more, severely delayed end of it, they're in a really high sympathetic state. Now, the sympathetic nervous system also activates the pro-inflammatory part of the immune system. And the right hemisphere is more connected with the parasympathetic and the anti-inflammatory pathways. So the balance of that, what we know in kids with autism is that they have a high sympathetic tone, they have more inflammation, they have leaky gut, they don't produce digestive enzymes the way they should, they don't have the acid like they should, so they don't have the right pH balance, so they can develop fungus or yeast infections or parasites in their gut that never should be able to live there. They have malabsorption syndrome. They're constipated because they don't have peristalsis.
Yeah.
And all of it is really because the brainstem, and in that brainstem, in the same areas where all the primitive reflexes come from. And the primitive reflexes are supposed to go away over that first year as the parasympathetic nervous system comes on. And if the reflexes don't go away, that parasympathetic nervous system never came on. And that is where all of the gut and all of the immune and inflammatory issues, that's where it all comes from. It starts in the brain and the brainstem and the way the hemispheres regulate the immune system. It does not start in the gut. And so the new way of looking at neuroimmunology is not just looking at there's inflammation in the gut and it comes up and causes, some autoimmune encephalitis. Again, you have to look at why do they have autoimmunity? Because the left brain causes overactivation of the immune system. The sympathetic nervous system causes overactivation. And then they get an imbalance where they have what's called a Th2 dominance. They produce too many antibodies too easily and they're too sticky. And so they become sensitive to foods that they shouldn't. And then they can become sensitive even to their own body and their own brain. That's why these kids end up with eczema early on before they're even producing their own antibodies, which doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So the idea is that, it isn't just about creating inflammation in the brain. It's about an imbalance in the brain. And it's about how the brain and the nervous system regulate the immune system and regulate the parasympathetic. So rather than looking at it as starting in the body, starting in the gut and causing inflammation from the bottom up, it's the other way around. And both become a problem, but it starts in the brain and it starts in the brainstem. It doesn't start in the gut.
That is so fascinating and makes so much sense. And in everything, I mean, I have Crohn's disease and it didn't pop up until, I was around 30 years old. And so it's super amazing. And then my son and his, issues and everything that I've learned a lot about functional medicine and functional, and natural or natural medicine. It's very fascinating. That makes so much sense, you guys. That was so amazing. I'm so glad we had time to talk about that, and thank you for covering that, because I know a lot of parents with kids who have autoimmune issues or just little things that just like, how can I balance this? Where does it come from?
If we have just a couple more minutes.
Yeah.
Really fascinating thing. And this is really a real big focus of my research. And I wrote a paper partially on this. So one of the areas of the brain that really regulates the immune system and this sympathetic and parasympathetic, it's related to what's called the central autonomic network that starts in the brainstem and works its way up into the brain. And, part of it activates the HPA axis and the amygdala. But the real main part is an area called the insula. And the insula, on the right side of the brain especially, is where we actually have interoception, where we connect with our body. It's also where we become embodied, where we, at around 2 years of age, a child should recognize themselves in the mirror and understand that they're an individual person, and that there's them and others, right? That they're separate from other people. And that's where we gain what's called body ownership. Kids that are on the non-speaking end of it, they don't have that sense very much. And that's really the real reason why they don't speak, right? It's not that they don't have all the words are there, but they don't feel their body. They're so disconnected from their body. But that same area of the brain now is being related to something called immunoception, meaning where in the brain do we monitor and control the immune system? And there's multiple areas, but the main area is this area called the insula. So that when we look at autoimmune disorders, we lose the ability to recognize self from other, right? So we're attacking our own body. Our immune system is attacking our own body as if it was a foreign invader. So the immune system can't differentiate between itself and other. That happens in the insula, in the right insula, which is where we also recognize ourself as an individual person from another. You understand?
Yes.
So if you're not embodied and you don't feel like the understanding of self from other, it also impacts your immune system that way. And that is what leads to autoimmunity and food sensitivities and things of that nature. It's pretty fascinating stuff, I think.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I'm right. I wrote all that down. I need to look at that. Is fascinating. I absolutely love this. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation today. You guys, I have put in our newsletter and our emails the link to get in touch with Dr. Melillo. You can go to his website, drrobertmelillo.com, and you can get in touch with him directly there. You guys can schedule a consultation. I highly recommend it. This is fascinating. And also 2 weeks ago, I sent out his book, or the first book that he wrote. And so make sure, and that was Disconnected Kids, correct?
Yeah. Yes. And the third edition just came out this past summer.
Yeah. Super fascinating. I highly recommend you guys get that book. And I am super excited that we got to share you with everybody, and that this will live for whoever needs it in the future in our podcast. So thank you so much for your time today. And you guys, mind-blowing stuff today. Super amazing. I know a lot of people were really excited to hear you again. So thank you so much. And you guys, I will see you again next week.
Okay.